Welcome to Fireside Giants. My name is Alex and my co-host Anthony Rivardo. Today, some somber news, sad news, depressing news, or maybe some happy news, depending on who you are. Dave Gettleman has reportedly, by the New York Post and Paul Schwartz, is reportedly returning to the New York Football Giants as their general manager. And, earlier on in the week, this was a big topic of debate. Was Gettleman going to get the axe? Was he going to retire? Maybe they would move him to an advisory role. Clearly, he will be sticking around for at least another year. They saw enough from 2020 to make the decision that he is worthy of it, I guess. And we want to kind of go through that, what we think about this move of keeping Gettleman. Is it good? Is it bad? Why did they keep him? What is the Maras thinking? What is Tisch thinking? What is Joe Judge thinking, if he has the autonomy even? These are a lot of questions to answer. But before we dive into all of these, Anthony, how you doing, my friend?
Well, I'm not the biggest Gettleman guy, so I'm a little, frustrated and annoyed, but we'll talk about that. But overall, I'm doing good. I think that the Giants, if they're able to build on what they did last offseason, if they're able to repeat that success, what Gettleman did with Joe Judge last offseason, if they can repeat that this offseason, then I won't have much to complain about. But if it's a little similar to 2018 that offseason and 2019 offseason, if it's nothing like the 2020 offseason, then I will have plenty to complain about. But I guess we'll have to reevaluate that at the end of the offseason and then at the end of next season. And I feel like, yes, he did make it back, but I feel like he's still on a short leash, and I hope that's the case. I hope that, yes, his batting average went up in the 2020 offseason as John Mara made it a requirement for it to go up, and I hope that if it doesn't continue to go up, and if the Giants don't win more games next season, I hope that means that Gettleman would be gone the following season, because I understand bringing him back. I get why they did it. I'm not the biggest fan of the move, but I'm okay with it. I can live with it. But, going forward, if we don't see significant improvements from this team, I won't be okay with it. And I think that the Giants should not settle for 5-11 records and 6-10 records and mediocrity like that. So the New York Football Giants should be held to a higher standard, and I want to see them. Retaining Gettleman means to me that they have to, and they are going to win 9, 10, 11 games this season. And if they don't, then he will be fired. And if it goes any way different than that, then I'm going to just be completely pissed at the ownership.
Yep. Here's the thing, and I agree with you on one major point. I'm okay with them keeping him. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I'm okay with them keeping him for one reason, and it is because of the 2020 draft class and free agency class. That is the only saving grace for Gettleman. We're talking about 15 wins in 3 years, guys, averaging 5 wins per season. That is a terrible track record. That is a awful platform to stand on if you're Gettleman and saying, do I just even deserve to have my job right now? The reality is, 2018, there are not many players left from that class that are even on this team right now. Saquon Barkley being one of them, and he's been injured continuously over the past 2 seasons. So where do you go from here? 2019 equally wasn't the best draft class. A lot of those guys are either injured or not on the team anymore. 2 consecutive drafts where they were complete busts. And the free agent classes were also not great. Antoine Bethea, remember that? Remember that guy? These are Jonathan Stewart, Patrick Omameh, Curtis Riley. These are guys. What was the point of these decisions? I don't know. And here we are, like 2 years later after 2018, and we're wondering the same thing. Is this team on the right track? I think it is, but only because of Joe Judge and not because of Dave Gettleman. 2 very different things. Now, 2020 draft class, you walk away with seems to be your franchise left tackle and Andrew Thomas. He looked pretty good down the stretch. I think he is our answer there. Obviously, you have Xavier McKinney, who had a fantastic season finale against Dallas, and I think he's a solution, not a problem. You have Matt Parrott, who has the potential to be, at very least, a depth player, a good depth player, potentially a starter. You have Shane Lemieux, who is starting, very good in the run game. Needs some help in pass protection. You have Darnay Holmes, who I think is a starter. Just spoke to his trainer, Brian Walker. Just told me he thinks he can be an outside corner. He thinks Julian Love and him should be competing for that number 2 spot in 2021. I actually love that idea. Of course, you have Cam Brown, Carter Coughlin, who both played roles, specific roles they contributed this season. That's all you can ask from your later round guys, contributors. Blake Martinez said the last pick in the draft, Tay Crowder, he did not seem like a rookie. He actually helped calm him down, was a very nice presence on the field alongside Blake, so that's a really good sign. There's some really talented players that the Giants acquired this past draft that we can be happy about moving forward. And then you look at the free agency class. You have obviously Blake Martinez. You have James Bradbury, Graham Gano, who they extended, Logan Ryan, who they extended. They did phenomenal. They were phenomenal pieces. I would even toss in Leonard Williams there because he was signed to a new deal, essentially. So these guys really came together and performed way above expectations. And as a Giants fan and someone who's been reporting on the team this past few seasons, I can say confidently that we are looking up. And that is the reason that Dave Gettleman is getting another chance here, because the progress that we saw, the free agents and draft class that we have witnessed this past year have been so promising and have really shown us what we can accomplish. With that being said, if we don't win 7 games or more next year, honestly, if you don't win 8 games or more next year, he should be fired, right? He gets one more year to prove this team can be a playoff contending team, because they were not this year. This team this year was not a playoff team. The defense was, the offense was not. And you can blame Jason Garrett for all of that, in my opinion. The offense should have performed better. We were far from average. We were way below average. Obviously losing Saquon, he built the scheme around Saquon, and he didn't have him. So that was a big, big factor. You have to give credit a little bit there. But there's a lot to talk about with Dave Gettleman in terms of the mistakes he made, and do they justify keeping him, Anthony? And do you think that they do? Do you think that the decision to draft Saquon Barkley, to do all of these things that now in hindsight look like bad moves, do you think that those overwhelm the positives from this past season? Because at a certain point, I think they might.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, a lot of what he did in the 2020 offseason, and I think that's a good thing to bring up because he did a great job in the 2020 offseason. So if he's getting an extra year for what he did in the offseason, that's one thing. But if he's getting an extra year based on what they did in the regular season, that's another thing, because we only went 6-10. We promised to see more wins, and we improved the record by only 2 wins. So no matter what he does each offseason, if the team doesn't start winning more games, and we talk all season long about how there's a hole here on the roster, a hole there on the roster, not enough talent here, not enough talent there. Whose fault is that but Dave Gettleman's? He's the guy who puts the talent together on the roster. He's the one who hasn't put together a playoff team in 3 years of being on this team. And yeah, we were 6-10 and we almost made the playoffs, but we were 2 games below 500. That's not necessarily impressive by any means. We just played in a historically terrible division. And, we almost made the playoffs, and I guess that has something to do with John Mara wanting to bring Gettleman back, because he feels like the Giants were really close this year, because at 6-10 they almost made the playoffs. But I don't know if that's really something to feel confident in, that at 6-10 you almost made the playoffs. Like, everybody who views us or listens to us knows that I was really excited and really wanted playoff football, and I didn't care what our record was. I just wanted to get into the playoffs. But that doesn't mean that I can't look at this team that's 6-10 and realize and recognize that there's a lot of holes on this roster. There's a lot of talent that needs to be added before we are a legitimate playoff team, and that we weren't a legitimate playoff team. We just had the chance to go to the playoffs as an illegitimate playoff team. And that was exciting. We can all admit that. But in 2021, we have a big free agency period ahead of us. We have a big draft ahead of us, just big offseason ahead of us. If Gettleman and Judge can combine to have another offseason like they had last season, but string together more wins in the regular season, I will get on board with this move. And 7 wins, 8 wins, not enough. We're talking 9, 10, 11 wins. Somewhere in that range is what has to happen in order for me to be okay with Dave Gettleman as a general manager. You cannot have a 15-33 record and continue down the path of 5-11, 6-10, 7-9. Or, next year there's an extra game on the schedule, so 7-10, right? 17-game schedule. But you have to actually, at one point, have a winning season if you want to be called a successful GM. And you should have multiple winning seasons. In 3 years, the Giants should have turned it around by now. I understand 2018, they didn't start the rebuild. We all know in hindsight they should have. But really, in hindsight, I knew they should have, and a lot of other people did too, and Dave Gettleman didn't. So, I don't know. A lot of people like to blame John Mara for that and say John Mara forced Dave Gettleman to build around Eli one last time. And if that's the case, then sure, maybe you can give Gettleman a little bit of a pass for that 2018 offseason. But there were still other decisions that he made that you can't really give him a pass for. Drafting Kyle Lauletta, trying to win while rebuild. Things like that you can't really give him a pass for just like that. You have to hold him accountable, and I don't feel like the Giants have fully done that. Now, I will say, 2019, he made his most important draft selection of his life when he picked Daniel Jones 6th overall in the 2019 NFL Draft. He got a lot of flack for that and a ton of criticism for drafting Daniel Jones 6th overall. Hindsight, that was a good decision. He picked the right quarterback. He picked him over Drew Lock, Drew Lock is a decent player. He's definitely better than the other guy. Dwayne Haskins, he drafted Daniel Jones over, and that was the big one that everybody wanted the Giants to draft, myself included. I was a Haskins guy, so I can admit that I was wrong there. But he drafted Daniel Jones in 2019, and in 2020, in Daniel Jones' sophomore season, he really took a big step. I don't know if everybody really realizes that. Pro Football Focus, if you put any stock into what they say, they agree with that. My analysis agrees with that. Alex's analysis agrees with that. We've watched a lot of film this year on Daniel Jones. We've seen a lot of growth from that young quarterback, and we can feel very confident about him going forward. So if you want to look at that selection, by far the most important of Dave Gettleman's life, and say he hit on that, then yeah, that can be your reasoning and justification for bringing Dave Gettleman back. Go ahead and add to it.
Yeah, I want to add one thing. I'm looking at a chart right now, and Daniel Jones had the hardest strength of schedule for quarterbacks this year.
I saw
by
that.
a significant margin.
I saw that.
Okay. And
he fought through a lot.
Paired together, he fought through a lot. And it's not just the strength of schedule. It's the malpractice play calling. It's the losing Saquon Barkley. It's the 30 rookie offensive linemen that played significant snaps at some point in the season. It's a lack of playmakers. It's a lack of energy. And the Evan Ingram turnovers, the drops, the COVID, the no preseason, the opt-outs. There were so many factors. The injuries, there were so many factors that I can tell you right now were against Daniel Jones. And he still managed to at least instill some confidence in the fan base that he can be the guy on some occasions. This is a quarterback who had everything going against him. A new head coach, new faces, a new scheme, an offensive play caller who did nothing, and all the other things I just listed. We're talking about the average quarterback in the NFL: Matt Ryan, Lamar Jackson, Pat Mahomes, and not the average quarterback, but the average strength of schedule for the quarterbacks. Those three guys: Matt Ryan, Lamar Jackson, Pat Mahomes, Joe Burrow, Drew Brees. All of those guys had average strength of schedules, and Daniel Jones had the most by a very big margin. The next guy behind him was Nick Mullins. So right off the bat, we can make excuses. We can say this, we can say that. I think DJ had a lot of weaknesses this year. He has a lot to work on. There's no debating that. But next year, you get him a wide receiver one, and that should be Dave Gettleman's number one thing to do this offseason. Get Daniel Jones more support.
Look at what he did for Josh Allen.
Yep, look what Stephon Diggs did for Josh Allen. And look, the reality is, if they don't do that, if he doesn't get that done, it's a fireable offense.
If Gettleman gets that done, though, if Dave Gettleman does get that done, and we see that year 3 breakout from Daniel Jones, I don't know if you listened to his interview, his postseason interview yesterday. It was kind of funny. Somebody asked him about the year 3 breakout for quarterbacks, and he was like, no, I've never heard of that. I'm just focused on the offseason. Classic Daniel Jones response. It was pretty funny. But that year 3 breakout is a real thing. We saw that with Josh Allen. We've seen it with other quarterbacks in the past. If he can get his wide receiver one, if Gettleman can get him that and improve, a couple other things around him, and Daniel Jones can have that year 3 breakout, then absolutely I will be on board with Dave Gettleman. If his number one draft pick of his life can prove to all of us right now that he absolutely has a future with this team, I'll get on board with Dave Gettleman, because that was the number one decision that he had to hit on. And if he did, then that can make up for a lot of the sins that he committed in the past.
That's right. And there's a lot of sins, man. There's a lot of sins that he has to make up for, but I think I've seen enough, and look, the jury's still out. I'm not going to sit here and tell you right now that I 100% agree with the move, but I also don't 100% disagree with the move. It very much is a wait and see. How is he going to perform? Can he get the job done type of decision? And Mara clearly sees things that we aren't seeing behind the scenes. Maybe Joe Judge thinks he's a good fit for him because honestly,
That's
what
what I
we
was going
saw,
to say.
because right, and honestly, what we saw was Joe Judge and Gettleman actually did well together, whether we want to believe it or not. Maybe some of the coaching hirings weren't great. We know Colombo obviously fired midseason, and then to Jason Garrett, who a lot of us after watching the film want them to move on from. When it comes to Joe Judge and Gettleman, they did a good job together. They actually fit well. They both have a very similar old school style of play. Hard-nosed football, run the ball, establish the run, time of possession, no mistakes, disciplined football. And I think the Maras saw that. The Maras saw that they actually did well together this past offseason. They made some good signings. They made some good draft selections. And we saw progress because of it. And they have to factor in all the things I listed before with the COVID and everything in between. And, that's why everyone was so mad about the Eagles situation, because everything that the league went through, all the people, and you want to know something crazy? Running backs coach Burton Burns, talk about the Eagles disrespecting everybody by tanking that game on national television. Burton Burns hasn't seen his daughter and family since July. A lot of coaches, a lot of stories around that, and the NFL are just like that. A lot of coaches sacrificed everything to be here, doing their job in the NFL. And to lay down and not perform and not play after a season like that, like the Eagles did, was really just a smack in the face of all those guys who really left everything on the line and played their heart out and coached their heart out because they wanted to win. And they're playing for their jobs. They're coaching for their jobs. And I think Gettleman and Judge, they did that this year. They coached, they GM'd for their jobs. And maybe Gettleman deserves a second chance, really a fourth chance because of it. That's all I can say on the matter, is that he did enough with Joe Judge to say to me, this offseason was different. We saw progress. And to throw a wrench in that right now might not be the best idea. But as I said before, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm 100% confident he's the guy to go with. He's the guy that we should trust moving forward. We need a little bit more time to evaluate that duo of Judge and Gettleman.
Yeah, and another thing that I want to mention is with Judge and Gettleman, we do have to give some credit to Dave Gettleman for the hiring of Joe Judge. That wasn't 100% a John Mara and Steve Tisch decision. Dave Gettleman had input in that. He had a large say in what happens with the head coaching position, and he helped hire Joe Judge, and we can all agree that Joe Judge has been excellent for the Giants. We all agree that we believe in him going forward. We think that he will be the head coach of the Giants for a long time. I fully believe that as a number one leader of the Joe Judge fan club. Absolutely. So I can give a lot of credit to Dave Gettleman for that, and I can give credit to Gettleman and Judge for what they did in tandem together in the offseason. Partially throughout the season, we didn't really have the best record, but we did see a lot of improvements from a lot of those guys that they signed, and we saw a lot of improvements. Judge put together a good coaching staff. And I understand the idea of keeping continuity. You don't want to bring in a new GM necessarily and have him clash ideas with Joe Judge and give him a set of rules and restrictions that he has to abide by before he gets here. That might not necessarily work out, which is why I think that if the Giants were going to fire Dave Gettleman, it should have happened the last offseason. I wouldn't have complained if it happened now, but I do understand that it would have been really difficult to try and find a replacement GM, especially with everything going on in the COVID situation right now, trying to get interviews and get a general manager. You're probably doing Zoom interviews, and then you might have technical difficulties. It just might be really difficult to hire a general manager right now. It could be easy to fire one, but it might be really difficult to hire one. So I understand wanting to keep continuity with Joe Judge, and if it pays off, I will be happy about it. But just know that with Dave Gettleman staying this year, the bar has completely been raised, and they have to jump a really large hurdle in order for me to believe in Dave Gettleman for another year after this one. They are going to have to get that batting average up even further, and they're going to have to see this team win more games and actually be a competitive playoff team.
Yep, that you pretty much summed it up. And just before we wrap up here on the Dave Gettleman segment, I do want to add one thing about free agency that I think is going to be interesting, because I just thought about it and it actually makes sense. with them adding that 17th game to the regular season next year, that is going to make players want more money. They're playing an extra game. They want more money because of that, because the NFL is making more revenue. Those two things go hand in hand.
How is the cap space going down? That's my question.
Well, no. That's the thing, though. That's exactly where I'm headed with this. The cap space is expected to go down as much as $20 million. They're projecting about $7 million because of COVID-19. I think because of that, a lot of players are going to take one-year deals for 2021 because teams are not going to be dishing out massive contracts. And I think they're going to wait until the 2022 season to cash in on the multi-year deals because they're going to say, now that the NFL is back to normal, the cap space has gone up $25-30 million. You guys can afford to pay us a lot more. Next year, this upcoming offseason, they know they're not going to be getting top dollar because of COVID. But next offseason, you're going to see new benchmarks being set. So I could totally see guys like Corey Davis, Kenny Golladay, who's been injured all year, accepting one-year prove-it deals and then cashing in after next season. So the Giants, if they're looking for a wide receiver one and they don't necessarily want to draft a guy, they could look to Kenny Golladay and say, "Hey man, you were injured pretty much all season. Why don't you take a one-year prove-it deal with us, and then perform really well, and then get a multi-year extension, and then max out your bench." That's the thought that crossed my mind. It makes sense in my head because of what's happening due to COVID. But what do you think about that?
I think that's really interesting. I do think there's some truth to it, but I also do think that the players that do sign long-term contracts are just going to require, with whichever team they sign them with, that they backload the contracts once the cap space goes up.
But
they get
a lot
more
of teams
money.
don't like to do that,
or
though.
I know a lot of them don't, but a lot of players. If you see some premier players do what I'm about to say, like Allen Robinson, Kenny Golladay, like you mentioned, any of the top tier free agents, they could potentially tether their salaries to the salary cap. Where if the salary cap increases, so does their salary by a certain percentage. That was something that they talked about with Patrick Mahomes, that he might tether his salary cap. Ultimately, he did not do that. But that is something that's possible to be done and something that could start to be a trend in the NFL this offseason, especially with all of the uncertainty around the COVID-19 vaccine and virus. And then one last thing that I want to mention about Dave Gettleman before we wrap up is the acquisition of Leonard Williams, because we didn't mention that, and that is a really crucial part of the Dave Gettleman era, right? The acquisition of Leonard Williams. I will go ahead and say this, that I was wrong. I didn't like that when it happened. I liked it at first, then I looked into it, and I was like, okay, I don't like this. And then once they didn't re-sign him, and he was just okay after those 8 games last year, I really didn't like it. But then this year, they paired Leonard Williams with Patrick Graham, and we found a brand new version of Leonard Williams where he was a premier pass rusher who ended the season with 11.5 sacks. It was incredible what they did with Leonard Williams this year and how they got absolutely the most out of him. So credit to the coaching staff for that, and credit to Dave Gettleman for finding a premier pass rusher that everybody in the league had already given up on. And the Giants didn't give up on him. And I do think that another year in Patrick Graham's system and another pass rusher on the edge to help take a little pressure off of Leonard Williams and give him more one-on-one blocks, we could see him repeat with another double-digit sack season and maybe even get the total up further. So I was wrong about that. I'll say it, and I will give credit to Dave Gettleman for finding Leonard Williams for a 3rd and 5th round pick. But now what we're going to get into this offseason is how long is Leonard Williams going to be around for? Is he going to get this big lucrative contract, and how much is that going to cost us? Is he going to get franchise tagged again? I don't know. We will see. That will be another discussion for another video and another podcast episode. But Dave Gettleman, I will give you a lot of credit for finding Leonard Williams.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think the decision to spend draft capital on him is separate from how well he's doing this year. They could have easily just signed him as a free agent, and probably would have been a lot cheaper. It would have been a lot cheaper than they would have. They're going to pay him this offseason most likely, unless, like you mentioned, they could franchise tag him. But of course, discussion for a different day. We're gonna go through all this stuff, guys. So you're gonna want to stick around for the draft analysis, the prospect breakdowns, the film stuff, and big, really cool news. I actually, spoke to Brian Walker himself, and he said he's gonna try and get our guys Darnay Holmes and Jabril Peppers on the podcast to break down film of them with us. If you wanted elite content, you are getting it. We are going to change things. dropping bombs, right? So if you made it this far into the episode, you're gonna hear it first. Keep it to yourself because that's gonna be a surprise. But as always, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Love the support, and hopefully you guys are having better days now. The off season's over. Maybe a little time, a little bit less emotional stress. You know me during the season. I'm a wreck for most of the time because we're losing so much. But progress is on the way. Dave Gettleman's staying. Let's see where he takes us. And as always, we'll catch you on the next one.